Today, we have an amazing speaker with us, a gentleman who has written a book called Mansfield and Dirksen. Now, those of you who've been watching these series over the years know that I spent 6 years working in the Senate. So 2 of those years, my office was in the Dirksen Senate office building. And I can't tell you the number of times that I was at meetings in the Mansfield room and the Capitol, which is one of the most prestigious rooms that you can go to in the Capitol. So looking today at Mansfield and Dirksen, bipartisan giants of the Senate, could not be more timely. It was just last night when we saw an amazing bipartisan activity where the House passed a bipartisan tax package by an overwhelming majority, more than 300 members of the House. And that question now goes to the Senate. So for all of those people who say there's no possibility that this Congress can work, I will say to you, perhaps they can. But let us look at lessons from the past. This book is a study of politics, an analysis of different approaches to leadership, a portrait of a Senate that functions, one in which 2 leaders, while exercising partisan political responsibilities for sure, could still come together to pass groundbreaking legislation. And their work reminds us what is possible. In the turbulent 1960s, even as battles over civil rights and the war in Vietnam dominated American politics, bipartisanship was able to prevail. One key reason: 2 remarkable leaders who remain to this day giants of the Senate. Republican leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois and Democratic leader Mike Mansfield of Montana, the longest serving majority leader in history. Today, Marc Johnson, a fellow at the Mansfield Center at the University of Montana and the author of 3 books on United States Senate history, all published by the University of Oklahoma Press, is here to talk with us. His latest book, Mansfield and Dirksen, Bipartisan Giants of the Senate, explores both the personal and the political relationship between these 2 towering figures in the 1960s. Johnson's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time magazine, and throughout scholarly journals. He served as the press secretary and chief of staff to Idaho's longest serving governor, Cecil D. Andrus, and so he's actually got some real life experience in politics, and is a graduate of South Dakota State University, currently living in Oregon. So, Mr. Johnson, tell us about these 2 bipartisan giants of the Senate. Who is Mike Mansfield? Who is Everett Dirksen? And what do they mean to us today?
Thank you so much, Jane. What a great pleasure it is for me to be here with you today under the banner of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, a great institution which I have a tremendous amount of respect for. The first sentence in this book, Mansfield and Dirksen, gives away my thesis. The sentence is, "This is a story about a Senate that no longer exists." I confess I really wanted to write about Mike Mansfield, and I searched high and low for a somewhat different angle than the standard biography of Mansfield, which exists. Was done in excellent form by Don Obendorfer, former Washington Post reporter, who spent hours interviewing Mansfield. I knew I couldn't top Don's great book, but I wanted to find an angle on the Mansfield story that cast a light on his leadership qualities, his approach to political leadership, which is, needless to say, not exactly common in our time as we view politics in America today. And it was sort of by happenstance that I came upon this relationship between Mansfield and Dirksen. And the book really centers on their personal and political relationship between 1961, when Mansfield became a majority leader following Lyndon Johnson, and Dirksen obviously was the Senate Republican leader at that time. And as Jane alluded to a moment ago, this relationship unfolded over the decade of the 1960s against a backdrop of really turbulent times in the United States. Vietnam, civil rights, church bombings in the South, the Bay of Pigs, a presidential assassination, the assassination of President Kennedy's brother, the former attorney general, and the killing of the most prominent civil rights leader in America. So these were tumultuous times, but somehow, even in the context of those times, Dirksen and Mansfield found a way to make the institution of the United States Senate work in a way that I think has some lessons for us today. So let's talk for just a moment about this unusual institution, the United States Senate. Perhaps the most common word used to describe the Senate these days is dysfunctional. And it's easy to think perhaps that the Senate has always been a place that didn't work very well. I love a quote from former Senator Howard Baker, another majority leader in the 1980s, 1990s. Howard Baker says, "What really made the Senate work is an understanding of human nature, an appreciation of the hearts as well as the minds, the frailties as well as the strengths of one's colleagues and one's constituents." Baker went on to say, "I formulated my theory that being a leader in the Senate was like herding cats. It is trying to make 99 independent souls act in concert under rules that encourage polite anarchy and embolden people to find majority rule a dubious proposition at best." So the Senate, strictly speaking, is not a democratic small d institution. Perhaps the most undemocratic representative institution in the democratic world, with the possible exception of the British House of Lords. Every state has 2 senators. In writing the Federalist Paper 62, James Madison conceded that the arrangement had no basis in democratic theory, that it was an accommodation to get Southern slaveholding states to agree to the Constitution. So today, Wyoming, with 585,000 residents, is represented by 2 senators, and California's 39 million citizens are represented by 2 senators. There are the quirky rules in the Senate: the unlimited debate, the filibuster, protection for the minority, the seniority system about who presides over important committees in the Senate. The Constitution bestows upon the United States Senate great power: confirmation of cabinet members, federal judges, Supreme Court justices, the power to ratify treaties. And at least by historical standards, the Senate has always had a major voice in American foreign policy. So that's the Senate we have. And despite pundits from time to time saying we need to reform the Senate, do away with this every state having 2 senators, somehow change the makeup, well, that requires a change in the Constitution, and it's not likely to happen in our lifetimes. So it sounds quaint to say, but the 2 men who are the subject of this story were, in the best sense of the word, Senate institutionalists who subscribed to Mansfield's view, as he often said, that the Senate is the rock of the Republic. So here's Ev Dirksen in a posture that he frequently assumed, sitting cross-legged on a desk, cigarette dangling between fingers, pontificating to a collection of Capitol reporters. This is the way he conducted his news conferences. Dirksen was utterly unlike any politician in American life today. He had a gravelly baritone voice. He was an excellent speaker, great sense of humor, peppered his talks with humorous stories and one-liners. He started out his life wanting to be an actor, and his mother actually convinced him that there was no economic future in the stage, even though he acted in plays and wrote a number of plays. He finally succumbed to the temptation of show business by other means, perhaps, and decided to go into politics. He had this mop of unruly white hair, perhaps the most distinctive voice in American politics in this period, with the possible exception of John Kennedy's Boston brogue or Lyndon Johnson's Hill Country twang. One reporter dubbed Dirksen the Wizard of Ooze, and it stuck. Others called him Honey Tonsils, the buttered larynx, and the rumpled magician of the metaphor. And as I said, this picture is a common pose for Dirksen as he talks to Capitol reporters. Mansfield was the polar opposite in many ways of Dirksen. Quiet, shy, ramrod straight, part of his Marine Corps training, perhaps. Parenthetically, I'll add that as far as I know, and research confirms this, Mike Mansfield is the only member of the United States Congress to serve in 3 different branches of the US military. He lied his way into the United States Navy at the age of 15 during World War I, served on a cruiser in the Atlantic, later served in the Army, and ultimately in the Marine Corps. You'll see in this photograph 2 things that Mansfield seemed never to be without: his pipe and that little lapel pin, which is the Marine Corps emblem. Even though he was the Senate Majority Leader, as Jane mentioned, for 16 consecutive years, he seems almost devoid of ego and had no lust for publicity. Again, kind of the polar opposite of Dirksen. In 1964, Mansfield was on the cover of Time magazine, something that he absolutely hated. When Neil McNeil, the Time correspondent, covered Congress, took Mansfield off the Senate floor one day and whispered to him that the editors of Time had decided to put Mansfield on the cover, put him on Mount Rushmore, as McNeil noted. Mansfield said, "Oh, that's terrible. How can we stop that?" He did not want that kind of publicity. Dirksen, by contrast, loved the press attention. So here's a great photo of Dirksen surrounded by leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Martin Luther King, James Farmer, Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers Union, who was a big benefactor of the civil rights movement, and a very young John Lewis, later to become congressman from the state of Georgia. The centerpiece in many ways of the Mansfield-Dirksen relationship revolves around the Civil Rights Act's passage in 1964 and the subsequent passage in 1965 of the Voting Rights Act, pieces of legislation that Mansfield considered the most important to come before the Senate during his time in that body. So this is a remarkable photo illustrating Dirksen as the leader of the Senate effort to defeat a filibuster led by Southern Democrats so that they could pass a landmark piece of legislation. So one thing that it's really important to understand that made the Senate of the 60s so much different from the Senate of our era was the less than homogeneous ideology of the 2 political parties. So you had Republicans who were very conservative, you had more moderate Republicans, you even had liberal Republicans. Dirksen tended to straddle the moderate conservative wing of his party, but he reached out regularly to the more liberal members of his caucus. The Democratic caucus was much the same way. A great amount of power in the Senate was wielded by Southern Democrats in the 60s, people like Richard Russell of Georgia and James Eastland of Mississippi, very, very powerful committee chairman. So they were generally conservative in their political outlooks and absolutely institutionally opposed to civil rights legislation, to the point of successfully up until 1964, with one exception, in the late 50s, stopping civil rights bills from passing through the Senate. So confronted with the death of President Kennedy in November of 1963 and Lyndon Johnson's determination to push Kennedy's agenda through Congress, including a civil rights bill, Mike Mansfield, the majority leader, realizes the only way to accomplish that Herculean task would be to work in close harmony with his Republican counterpart, Senator Dirksen. So in a way that is hard to fathom today, Mansfield essentially turned over Senate leadership, even though the majority was held by Democrats in a sizable way, more than 60, I believe 67 Democrats in the Senate in this period. He essentially turned over the leadership of the civil rights issue to Dirksen. He knew he had to overcome a filibuster by the segregationist Democrats in his own party, and he had to give Dirksen the political running room to work his legislative magic with his fellow Republicans. I want to just quote briefly from a short section of the book that deals with the civil rights legislation in 1964. Mike Mansfield said on the floor of the Senate as the debate began on the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, "Great public issues are not subject to our personal timetables. They do not accommodate themselves to our individual preferences or convenience. They emerge in their own way and in their own time. We do not compel them. They compel us. We look in vain if we look backwards to past achievements which might spare the Senate the necessity of a difficult decision on the civil rights question. We hope in vain if we hope that the issue can be put over safely to another tomorrow, to be dealt with by another generation of senators. The time is now. The crossroads is right here in the Senate." So Mansfield and Dirksen took on civil rights as a partnership, and Dirksen had to convince enough of his fellow Republicans to vote for cloture, to end the filibuster, to allow a final vote on the bill, and he accomplished that in a fairly remarkable way. And he deserves a tremendous amount of credit, I believe, for the passage of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964. So just think about the context for a moment. Here you have the Republican and Democratic leaders of the Senate working in absolute harmony with each other, showing total respect and candor for their approach to the issue. And Dirksen, in an election year, a presidential election year, 1964, is going to deliver to the Democratic president a huge political victory. So there was a story just this morning about a very senior senator from Iowa, Chuck Grassley, saying that he would resist efforts to bring legislation dealing with immigration to the Senate floor because it could present a victory for a Democrat in the White House. That's the absolute flip side of the way Dirksen approached civil rights in 1964. So to get the votes, Mansfield determined early on that he would rely upon no tricks. There would be no subterfuge, no backroom deals. He even went so far as to have a meeting with the man he knew who would lead the filibuster in the Senate, Dick Russell from Georgia. And he told him exactly how he was going to proceed handling the Civil Rights Bill. We know this happened because, remarkably, and this is great for historians, Mansfield, a history professor before getting into politics, kept detailed notes of many meetings that he had on these important issues during his time as majority leader. So he met with Russell and then reduced the essence of that meeting to a memo, which is in his papers at the University of Montana in Missoula. And he confessed that he wasn't sure that Russell believed him, that Russell was skeptical, that there wouldn't be some effort to catch the filibustering Southern Democrats unaware and try to pull a trick to get the bill moved more quickly. But that was just simply not Mansfield's way of dealing with things. Here's another great picture of Dirksen from this period. Lots of people have said that his most famous quotation was "a billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money." Trouble is, apparently he never said that. The folks at the Dirksen Center in Pekin, Illinois, the Dirksen Congressional Center, have searched high and low for the source of that quote and have not been able to find it. It sounds like something Dirksen would have said, but in fact, he did not say that. So consistent with his belief that Dirksen had not only to be seen as influencing the Civil Rights Bill, but he genuinely had to lead the effort. All the meetings leading up to the effort to end the filibuster in 1964, all the meetings about strategy were conducted in Dirksen's office. Dirksen was the one who was speaking to the press at the end of the day. He met with the delegation of clergy and civil rights leaders. Dirksen got the attention. Dirksen could accurately claim to skeptical Senate Republicans that he was looking out for them and the Republican Party's best interests. Ironically, the party's Republican presidential candidate in 1964, Barry Goldwater from Arizona, was one of the Republicans who voted against the Civil Rights Bill. In the end, the Senate endured an 83-day filibuster, 534 hours, 1 minute, and 51 seconds of debate before voting 73-27 for this historic legislation. All the Democratic no votes came from the states of the old Confederacy, prompting Lyndon Johnson to say that Democrats had lost the South for a generation, which turns out to have been a decidedly too optimistic prediction. Dirksen, deservedly so, receives a great deal of credit for this legislation. Mansfield said simply, "Yep, I was after the votes, not the publicity, and we got them." This is my favorite photo from the book, and it says so much about Dirksen and Mansfield. This is Dirksen admiring a portrait of himself, and you can see the bust of Abraham Lincoln in the background. Dirksen loved the fact that he represented in Congress, before he went to the Senate, the congressional district that had been represented by Abraham Lincoln. And he loved to be called the senator from the land of Lincoln. When Lyndon Johnson wanted to butter him up a little bit, he would refer to Dirksen as being worthy of being the senator from the land of Lincoln. But Dirksen, not publicity shy as Mansfield was, is enjoying this, gazing at this portrait of himself. And Mansfield, as he typically was, is off to the side, peering over the minority leader's shoulder. This is another great photograph. This is the Democratic leadership at the White House in probably about 1960, early 1963. So you have the House leaders there, Speaker McCormick talking to Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Carl Albert, the majority leader, Hale Boggs, the majority whip. And then on the other side of the picture, Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota, who was Mansfield's deputy, and Senator Symington from, Symington, I believe, from Missouri. And Mansfield has got his back to the camera and he's leaving the press conference. He's headed out back to his office on Capitol Hill. John Kennedy enjoyed this photograph so much that he had a copy made and inscribed it to Mansfield. And the inscription said, "To Mike, who knows when to go and when to stay." So you can look high and low for photographs of Mansfield, the majority leader, at the famous occasion of the signing of the Civil Rights Bill or the Voting Rights Bill in 1965, and he's never in those photos. Dirksen always right front and center, Humphrey right in front and center. Politicians love the limelight, and Mansfield, almost unique in my experience, in not wanting the limelight, and actively always positioning himself so he would be cropped out of any picture of a signing ceremony. Remarkable to me that in his 24 years in the Senate, Mansfield never had a press secretary, never had an office in Montana, frequently only visited the state a couple, 3 times a year, would make the rounds of coffee shops in smaller communities, meet with constituents, talk to reporters. That was the essence of his approach to politics. This is a photo of Mansfield and Kennedy, John Kennedy, in Billings in 1963. In the fall of that year, Kennedy had mounted a major Western swing to talk about his conservation efforts. And he got to Billings and he was already tired of the conservation message. So he lapsed into a long discourse on the fact that the Senate had just passed, ratified the treaty that created the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was one of the signature accomplishments of the Kennedy administration. The first successful effort to control nuclear arms production between the United States and the then Soviet Union. And Kennedy gets to Billings. He lavishes praise on Mike Mansfield, but also on Everett Dirksen, who he said had helped convince the Senate that ratifying this landmark treaty was in the nation and the world's best interest. Both of these men, Mansfield and Dirksen, had remarkable relationships with the presidents that they served with. Mansfield particularly close to John Kennedy. They came to the Senate at the same time in 1952. They sat together. Their desks were adjacent to each other on the Senate floor. Irish Catholics, although Kennedy obviously came from slightly more economically advantageous upbringing than Mansfield, who was a high school dropout, had, by his own admission, had gotten into trouble as a young kid, and had wound up after his military service working in the copper mines in Butte, Montana. But he became very close to John Kennedy. And when the discussion turned after Kennedy's election in 1960 to who would succeed the powerful and often overbearing Lyndon Johnson as the Senate Majority Leader, the consensus choice was there was no other option. It would be Mansfield. And one of Kennedy's aides, Kenny O'Donnell, said to the president-elect, "Are you sure that Mansfield is really up for this job? He may not be tough enough to, run the Senate in the way that we're going to have it run in order to accomplish our legislative agenda." And Kennedy looked at his trusted aide and said, "I want somebody in the Senate that I can trust." And Mike Mansfield is that man. Kennedy, of course, assassinated in November of 1963, a tragic day in Dallas. And Mike Mansfield is the one who is remembered to this day as delivering an emotional eulogy in the Capitol building, in the rotunda, which was kind of controversial at the time. Many people did not understand the story behind Mansfield's short eulogy to President Kennedy. He had read a news account over that horrible weekend in late November of 1963 about how Mrs. Kennedy had taken a ring from her finger, a wedding ring from her finger, and placed it in the president's hand before his coffin was closed. And Mansfield used that terminology. She took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hand to craft a poem almost about Kennedy's accomplishments and the tragedy that befell the country with his murder. After that short eulogy, he took a copy, walked over to where Mrs. Kennedy was standing in the rotunda of the Capitol and delivered it to her. And she said, "How did you know I wanted that?" And he said, "I wanted you to have it." He had a very close relationship with Mrs. Kennedy, both he and his wife, Moren, particularly after the assassination. And 10 years to the day of President Kennedy's death, Jacqueline Kennedy was watching a television special on the 10 years anniversary of that horrible event. And she was reminded of the eulogy, and she wrote the majority leader a very touching note about how no one had understood the magnitude of the loss to the country of the death of her husband, as well as Senator Mansfield. Dirksen and Lyndon Johnson had a particularly close relationship as well. And I can talk some more about that perhaps in the Q&A section. I want to touch just briefly here before we go to some questions on what was accomplished during this decade of the 1960s. And this is really just a partial list. I mentioned a few of these things: Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Immigration Reform Act passed during the Johnson administration. The Wilderness Act was created. Corporation for Public Broadcasting came into being. The National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, Medicare, Medicaid, on and on and on. Land and Water Conservation Fund. Pieces of legislation that have enduring impact in our country to this very day, all passed the Senate in the 1960s. And this is really important to understand what was different about the Mansfield and Dirksen era. Every single one of these pieces of legislation passed on a bipartisan basis. It was surprising to me, for me to learn, as I was doing research on some of these pieces of legislation, that a number of them actually passed on a voice vote. There wasn't even a recorded vote in the Senate on passage of some very significant legislation. So this was an era when any senator certainly had the right, under the rules, to filibuster a piece of legislation. But it happened very infrequently. It did happen during the civil rights and voting rights legislation, obviously. There were other filibusters during this period, but it wasn't the situation that we see now, where it takes 60 votes on virtually everything to advance a piece of legislation to a final vote. So this was the Senate doing something that Mike Mansfield had practiced and modeled as his own personal behavior. He would often say that one of the great attributes of political leadership is self-restraint. You might have the ability to do something. You might have the rules that would allow you to take a particular stand on an issue, or to bring the Senate to a halt with a filibuster or a hold on legislation or an appointment. But just because you had that right didn't mean it was the right thing to do. You had to exercise a high degree of restraint. And that was something that Mansfield talked about forever and ever. So with the possible exception of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in 1933, and again in 1935, the so-called second New Deal, no president had a more successful or impactful legislative agenda than Lyndon Johnson, while Mansfield was the majority leader and Dirksen was the minority leader. It's been said, and I think correctly so, that we still live in Lyndon Johnson's world. But if that is true, and I believe it is, we also live in the world of Mike Mansfield and Everett Dirksen. I want to end with just one more short paragraph. Bear with me for a moment. Mansfield's very deferential style of political leadership, his sense that, as he often said, that every senator is created equal, with all the rights and responsibilities that go with being a senator. The junior most member of the body had the same responsibilities and the same prerogatives as the most senior. And he truly practiced that kind of political leadership. Total candor, being willing to tell his political opponents exactly what he intended to do, and then see if he could find the votes to get it done. So it's a remarkable approach to political leadership. And it was criticized early on in his tenure, particularly by some fellow Democrats who maybe were longing for Lyndon Johnson's more dogmatic way of leading the Senate. And Mansfield listened to the criticism. Clearly, it bothered him. He took it to heart, and he prepared a speech that he was set to deliver in the Senate to explain his approach to political leadership. The speech was to be presented on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, the day that President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. So Mansfield never gave the speech in the Senate. It was entered into the congressional record. It's fair to say that every member of the Senate probably read the speech and understood what Mansfield was trying to do to describe his approach to political leadership. But it wasn't until the 1990s, when Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi was the majority leader, that he invited an aging Mansfield back to the Capitol. And in the old Senate chamber, Mansfield delivered the speech on political leadership that he was prepared to deliver many years earlier on that fateful day in Dallas. So I just want to read two paragraphs from this speech, which is quite remarkable in terms of how it describes political leadership. Mansfield says, "I do my best to be courteous, decent, and understanding of others, and sometimes I fail at that. But it is for the Senate to decide whether these characteristics are incompatible with leadership. I have tried to treat others as I would like to be treated, and almost invariably have been. And it is for the Senate to decide, too, whether that characteristic is incompatible with Senate leadership. And finally, within this body, I believe every member ought to be equal in fact, not less than in theory. They have a primary responsibility to the people whom they represent to face the legislative issues of the nation. And to the extent that the Senate may be inadequate in that connection, the remedy lies not in the seeking of shortcuts, not in the cracking of non-existent whips, nor in wheeling and dealing, but in honest facing of the situation, and by resolution of it by the Senate itself, by accommodation, by respect for one another, by mutual restraint, and as necessary, adjustments to the procedures of the body." In other words, Mansfield is saying, because of this quirky institution at the heart of our government, with the unlimited debate rules, the personal prerogatives of senators being always protected regardless of which party is in power, that the Senate can only function on the basis of this kind of approach to leadership: respect, candor, self-restraint, above all, keeping the institution elevated at even if it means at the expense of an individual members. Mansfield told the New York Times in an interview very late in his life in 1998, "I always felt the true strength of the Senate lay in the center, not on the right and not on the left, but with those people who could see both sides and were not so convinced of their own assumptions that they wouldn't listen to the other side." So I'll stop there, Jane, and be delighted to try to respond to some questions if there are some.
Well, of course we have questions. This is the Historical Society. We have a couple, and I'm going to try to put a couple of them together. You talked about how carefully they treated Mrs. Kennedy. And, you know, the Mike Mansfield's work is carried on by the foundation, which is named the Moren and Mike Mansfield Foundation. So can you tell us what was the role of political wives during this time, and how did that play out in this dynamic?
It's a great question, and I'm delighted that you ask it. Moren Mansfield was hugely influential in Mike Mansfield's life. She was a teacher in Butte, Montana in the 1920s when they met. And she told him, if you're going to make something of yourself, you need to complete your education. He was a high school dropout. So she said, I'll work, you go back to school, get a diploma, get a degree, and figure out how you want to lead your life. And he took that great opportunity that she presented to him and ran with it, essentially getting his high school diploma at the same time he was earning his bachelor's degree at the University of Montana. He went on to get a master's degree, became a very well-regarded scholar of Asian history and politics, and taught at the University of Montana. So she was fundamental in his professional life and a true love affair, I think, and partnership throughout his political career. So he insisted, for example, that when the library at the University of Montana in Missoula was named the Mansfield Library, that it was the Moren and Mike Mansfield Library. Same with the foundation, same with the Mansfield Center, which I'm proud to be associated with at Missoula. Mrs. Dirksen was no less involved in her husband's political life. She was, by all accounts, a very capable, very smart political operative. She understood Dirksen as well as anybody possibly could, and his approach to politics. There's one great story in 1962. It was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred right before the 1962 off-year elections. And Dirksen's on the ballot in Illinois. He's running for re-election to the Senate. And President Kennedy calls him and wants him to come to Washington to consult on how to handle the fact that Soviet missiles had been discovered in Cuba. So Dirksen turns to his wife after getting off the phone with President Kennedy and says to her, well, the president's called me to Washington. You're in charge of the campaign. And she went out and she made the personal appearances on his behalf. There's a funny story where Dirksen was very familiar with these presidents to the point of being able to josh with them and make jokes and have a good time, and obviously bend the elbow a little bit, particularly with Lyndon Johnson. And in one case, Luella Dirksen said to her husband, Ev, you cannot call the president Jack. You have to refer to him as the president when he calls. And sure enough, that lasted about one more telephone call, and he picks up the phone and says, yes, Jack. So both the women were enormously influential in their spouses' political careers.
And another question, it was such a tumultuous time during the 60s. And as you said, the diversity of opinion within the Republican Party and within the Democratic Party was much more complex than it is at this time. Did the opposition of the Southern Democrats to the Civil Rights Bill bring Mansfield and Dirksen together, or did it drive a wedge between them?
It very much, Jane, it very much brought them together for very practical but very political reasons. Both of these guys wanted to pass a civil rights bill. They realized that the time had come, that the violence directed toward civil rights workers in the South and even in northern cities was frightening to both of these men. They knew that the country had to speak in a united way to provide legislation that could be enforced that would start to change the segregationist policies of many places in the country, not just the South. So the opposition of Southern conservative Democrats, people like Russell and Eastland, certainly drove Dirksen and Mansfield together in pursuit of that legislation. They both realized that it was absolutely critical, I think, for the country to speak on this, on that subject. In 1965, when some of you may be old enough to remember the events in Selma, Alabama in 1965, when Martin Luther King and his colleagues were attempting to conduct a voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And it resulted in Alabama state troopers assaulting these peaceful marchers at the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside of Selma. John Lewis was injured so badly that he had to be hospitalized. And it was a shocking event for Mansfield and Dirksen both. And they were determined that the country and the Senate particularly had to speak out in a forceful way to pass a Voting Rights Act in 1965. So very much an issue where they were compelled to put the national interest, I would say, above their own personal and partisan political interest. It was really about what the country needed to accomplish, how the country needed to make a statement about civil rights and voting rights. So remarkable moment in American history.
And now, one of the other complexities, let make this a twofold. Each of the senators had a colleague, because there are two senators from each state. How did they get along with their colleagues? Because here they were the leaders, and sometimes those relationships are a little complex.
Well, I had a historian of the Senate tell me one time that the most complex relationship in politics is between the two senators from any state, regardless of their partisan makeup. That it's just, there's a natural rivalry between two senators from the same state. And that rivalry, as near as I can tell, never really existed between Mike Mansfield and Lee Metcalf, who was the Democratic senator from Montana during the 60s. So much did Mansfield respect Metcalf that he essentially created for him the office of acting president pro tem of the Senate, so that Metcalf winds up presiding over much of the Senate debate on the Civil Rights Act in 1964. He was an excellent parliamentarian and knew the rules inside and out. Mansfield trusted him to be in the chair. When I had the opportunity to interview Senator Mansfield late in his life, I asked him about other great Montana political figures. I'm a little biased because I'm very enamored with Montana's political history, but arguably no state has produced as many first-rank national political figures as Montana has in the Senate. And I asked Mansfield about who some of these great political leaders were. And he said, I really have to take my hat off to Lee Metcalf because he often operated in my shadow and didn't get the credit that he deserved for a lot of things that he was able to accomplish. So a great deal of awareness on Mansfield's part that he had a very capable colleague in the Senate. For much of Dirksen's time in leadership, Paul Douglas from Illinois, a Democrat, represented the state. So you had a Republican and a Democrat in the Senate at the same time from Illinois. And they always had a little bit of a sparring relationship, I think very civil, but always wondering if the other was trying to pull a fast one for home state consumption. And then when Douglas retired and Chuck Percy was elected to the Senate as a Republican from Illinois, so Illinois has two Republican senators then in that period in the late 60s, Dirksen famously was pretty wary of Chuck Percy, a very handsome, outgoing guy who had presidential ambitions. And Dirksen famously told a reporter one time, well, what do you think of Senator Percy? And he said, well, I'm sort of ambivalent about him. And the reporter said words to the effect, well, that sometimes means that you like him sometimes and you don't like him sometimes. And Dirksen basically said, well, that's a crude way of putting it, but yes, you're getting the drift. So there was a certain tension between Dirksen and his home state Senate colleague. Not so much with Mansfield.
And now let's ask another question. One of the things that senators often do is, as they're, they look to their legacy.
Right.
Who will replace them as leaders? Did either Mansfield or Dirksen groom someone, and how did they do that in a way to preserve the bipartisan work they had done? Or
You know,
did they
I
just
think,
not do it at all?
yeah, that's a great question, Jane. I think Dirksen probably did more um, grooming, if you will, of a successor and wound up being Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania, a very moderate Republican, even a liberal Republican, who also had a very close personal and political relationship with Mansfield. This is in the early 70s, up until the time Mansfield left the Senate in 1977. Scott was a pipe smoker. He was a devotee of Asian art, a collector, and Mansfield and Scott shared that interest. But I think, I think Dirksen was constantly on the lookout for how to hold together this often fractious Republican caucus in the Senate, because Scott was considerably more moderate or even liberal than Dirksen himself. And so I think Dirksen was looking always for how to, create an environment where all the elements of the party structure could work with some harmony. And Mansfield, I think, also did very much the same, in the sense that he was willing to let the Democratic caucus basically pick his assistant leader. He never really interfered very much with saying it's got to be so-and-so to be my deputy. And it got him a little bit crosswise at times with some of his colleagues, because you may remember Jane Russell Long was the majority whip at one point, and he and Mansfield were not always on the same page together. But Mansfield took a very hands-off approach to leadership. Dirksen, not quite so much.
Okay, we got two. We're going to do lightning round, two last questions.
Okay.
One is this recording career. I mean, it's hard for people not today to imagine who's going to buy the records of a senator's speeches. How did that work?
Well, Dirksen had this terrific voice that was, unique in its gravelly baritone nature. And somehow, some way, someone approached him to record a spoken word record of a poem called Gallant Men. It was written by Charles Osgood, who recently passed away, the former CBS News correspondent, who had written it under another name, not Charles Osgood. And Dirksen recorded this in 1966, I believe, and he won a Grammy award for it. And it was very popular. And he loved the limelight that went along with being a recording artist as well as minority leader of the United States Senate. I love the story that he was the chairman of or the Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade one year. He was on that old television show, What's My Line? So he was, he was a performer and a very engaging performer at that.
So the recording career was not his Senate speeches, but his voice doing other things.
Exactly. Usually a very patriotic poem or a little story with heavy patriotic overtones. And this is the time when, the country is slipping deeper into involvement in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. And Dirksen's very much a supporter of Lyndon Johnson's foreign policy as it relates to Vietnam. Mansfield, not so much. And Dirksen saw the opportunity, I think, to, sort of provide a patriotic backdrop to what was happening in the country at that time.
Okay, last question. You write a book like this, people start talking, people talk to you. Now, obviously, it's speculation, but could these two gentlemen get elected by their respective states and their respective parties today?
It's a really, really good question, and I'm just making a wild supposition here by even trying to answer it. But I would say yes, and for one primary reason. The personalities of these two individuals were, I don't know, so compelling, Jane, so interesting, that people in their states felt like they really knew them. They really had a personal relationship with them. Now, this was the days, obviously, without cable television, without Twitter and social media and all the things that drive some of us to distraction today and help contribute to the polarization in the country. So I'm not sure how either one of them would have navigated that technology challenge. But the fact that they both were such compelling personalities, had good sense of humor, were willing to meet people where they were, I think it bodes pretty well for the chance that they might have been successful. Mansfield hardly ever spent a cent on his reelection campaigns. He basically just, as I said earlier, traveled around to coffee shops in Montana, held office hours and visited with people, rarely bought a television commercial or a newspaper ad in those days, and consistently won, landslide majority votes. And Dirksen only had one really close Senate election in his entire career in the Senate.
Well, I'm sure John Tester would love if he could do it that way. But thank you so much, Mark. We really appreciate your being with us, and we appreciate the fact that you wrote this book. It gives people a guidepost, and one of the things we try to do at the Historical Society is to highlight when we see Congress really working and what is it that takes. And what it takes is dedication of leaders who are willing to put the country first. And that is certainly what we have in Mike Mansfield and Ev Dirksen. As we move forward, we want to invite you to join us for our next adventure in public history. We have coming up, we've been doing an ongoing series about the constitutional amendments. What was going on at the time? What was the amendment? What does the amendment say, and how has it been used since it passed? We're at the 16th Amendment, which is the creation of the income tax. So next week, we have a legal historian talking to us about the evolution of the income tax. And coming up in early March, we have the last honest man, the CIA, the FBI, the mafia, and the Kennedys, and one senator's fight to save democracy. So both of those are interesting programs. We hope that you can join us for those activities. As we say, all of these programs are available only because of the support of our members and donors. Thank you so much for being contributors. Thank you for sharing this information with your friends and colleagues. This has been recorded. It will be available on our website. So if you found this conversation fascinating, just because somebody wasn't here